Hopefully that should have started now. So yeah, welcome everyone to the Public Policy Design Community Speaker Series. We have very exciting guest joining us today, Marco Steinberg, founder of Snowcone and Haystack, and for his talk on government and design. And just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. We'll be recording today's session, so if you want to come on and ask a question, you'll have to accept that. And the format will basically have 30-minute presentation, and yeah, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. But feel free to take a note of any questions that occur to you and pop them in the chat, and we'll come back to them in the Q&A part. I'll just hand over to Andy to give a bit of an overview of the community before we get started the session.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session. This is a public policy design community session. We're an expert community of practice of UK civil services policy profession. We're experts in using design upstream with ministers and accounting officers and special advisors and such. We're very welcoming, so we love that you're here, and we'd like to work with you again. So if you're not already a member of the community, you can find out how to join. We have different options depending on whether you're a UK official, or if you work for a UK government organisation, or we know with lots of you that are in private practice or are design researchers, and there are other ways for you to connect with us too, including through these monthly speaker events. But yeah, if you are a government official, then we have newsletters, monthly meetups where we have more speakers, and working groups where you're able to connect and work and build your practice with other designers across government. And there's lots of us. There's about 1,000 of us in 165 UK government organisations at the moment. We're always growing and always looking for new friends. So if you're interested in capability, design advocacy, building infrastructure for designers in the future, then we would love to be friends with you. Have a look at the link in the chat and please sign up and join. I will hand you back to Tessa.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I think we'll get started. So I'll pass over to you, Marco.
Great. Thank you, Andrew and Tessa, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to share some sort of practice reflections. Let me just put my presentation up, and I hope everybody can see it right now. I'm going to move quite fast and furiously. I'm trying to kill about 6 birds with 1 stone, because I think some of these issues are interconnected. So let me try to keep to about 30 minutes. I might go a few minutes past, but I'll try to do it so that we have maybe about a 15-minute chance to answer questions, and therefore I may suddenly abruptly just cut things. So don't get scared if suddenly the train of thought just stops. So I was talking to Andrew yesterday, and I said, how do I spin what is basically a reflection with lots of gloom and doom, for probably many of the reasons that we all share, and not to try to make it optimistic, but actually have a fairly thoughtful reflection on what the opportunities of this moment sort of afford us. The simplest way, I'll just put this up front so that it will help sort of buffer some of the gloom and doom, is that I always like to do this mental exercise where I go back to the most prehistoric pre-human that found this planet or was born into this planet. And they looked around, and if I'm a bit sort of overly simplistic, they saw sticks and stones, they saw rivers and trees. And then they looked around and then they said, well, you know what we could do with all of this? We could build cell phones and computers, and we could build information systems, and we can build AI, we can go to the moon. So the thing that always keeps me positive is to remind myself of the incredible power of human ingenuity. The challenge is that we need to mobilize that. All right. I put a menu together because there'll be things that you may want to talk about. I'll show this at the end. We can talk about unitary executive, strategic design, some reflections on the war in Ukraine, Finland, AI, a whole bunch of things, populism, et cetera, et cetera. So we can come back to this. All right. And I thought I would just start with a very short career path, but not because I'm particularly interesting, but because I think this is part of the challenge of how do we get a new kind of talent, new kinds of professionals into a system that over the last, let's say, 250 years has been increasingly fine-tuned to recruit, a known profile. And so how do we get new profiles? So I think my story just maybe illustrates what my background in design is, but also probably some of the challenges. People I've hired into government when I was working in government used to laugh that, I've helped them make them unemployed because there is no career path in the things that they're doing. So when I got out of high school, I took a gap year, and I'm from Finland, and I thought, well, I'd like to do architecture. So I went to the probably most premier architecture office in Helsinki, rang the doorbell, and the wife of Reima Pietilä, Riley, opened the door, and she looked at me and said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want to work for you." And then there was a long Finnish pause. And then she said, "Come on Monday and make coffee." So I spent a year starting with coffee, then cleaning drawings, then doing drawings and helping with models, and then going to construction. And bit by bit, I began to understand sort of the craft of architecture. And this is a drawing from an Aalto building. I like a lot of the tools that we use in architecture, and I see architecture as part of this broader design family. And we use drawings not to illustrate what we think and know, but as analytical tools. So a section through a building gives you insights that other means of representing a building don't. And it brings together many of the specialties that are necessary to put a building together, because at the same time you're looking at spatial sequences, acoustics, structures, piping, electrical. And so if we think of what is the architecture of the solution, I like to think of that as part of our task in government right now. Complex problems are du jour. And the challenge is really, how do we understand what is the underlying architecture of that problem, the architecture of the solution, and what are all the specialties that we as designers, as we as architects need to bring together to, in a way, create that large scale innovation that's sort of necessary. If we focus on just one aspect of this, then the danger is that we're using design in fabulous ways, but we're suboptimizing. We may actually be making the current problems worse by making them more beautiful or more acceptable, so to speak. So then I went to the US and studied architecture, and what I appreciated about the process of architecture then is the collaborative nature of it. The fact that 12 students in what we would call a studio would be given the same task, but come up with completely different ways of thinking about it. And there's a certain power there that by putting different kinds of minds together, you can begin to explore the range of opportunities that exist. And there's a learning and continual learning aspect of this. What I've done over the years is fundamentally take the studio model and ingrain it into the government activities that we've done, because fundamentally we're lacking some of the collaborative, creative forms of collaboration. We do a lot of collaboration in government, but it tends to be transactional. I'll bring my research and dovetail it in here. I'll do chapter 2. I'll write this bit, but we rarely come together to bring all of our experiences to create something that's new, completely uniquely sort of new. So I start with coffee and architecture. And then I got interested, not maybe so much in architecture per se. I mean, the tradition of architecture is interesting, but materials affect how we build and what we build. And so I got interested in materials and manufacturing processes. This is a plant that takes recycled newspaper, or basically paper you throw in the trash, and makes boards out of it. In the US, this is called Homosoap. It's a gray soft board and has good acoustical properties. And I was interested in, well, what would happen if we actually redesigned the manufacturing process? Would that lend itself to new kinds of applications? So in the design of process, more than the design of sort of the form, this is what started to get me interested. And by designing different manufacturing processes, you could have light or different textural qualities or different structures that allowed you then to bring basically paper as a construction material. And so these are some early prototypes. And that material interest then expanded to wood and plywood and veneers, and Charles and Ray Eames were a couple, architecture couple in the US, very innovative, and they did this fantastic leg splint. In World War II, in the Navy, one of the big problems for the US pilots that would be downed is that when they parachute out of their plane over water, when you hit water at a high speed, it's like hitting concrete. So fractures in the leg were very common. And so they created this before the advent of plastics out of wood, a leg splint to help stabilize the leg in the field. That's a very complex piece of plywood. It's done by cutting each veneer, each layer of wood individually, and it's kind of origamied together to make that sort of 3D. But it's also very craft-based and fairly imprecise. And so I thought, well, in the age of computer-aided design and manufacturing, could we do the cutting of the veneers, the geometry and the pressing of it in a much more sophisticated mass production sort of manner? And so here are some early prototypes of how you might unfold veneers, understanding that internal veneers are going to have a tighter curvature than externals if you want the edge of many sheets of wood to come together at a 90-degree. And what I love about this is you have to think about the grain of wood. It needs to be alternating, so you're doing a cross weave, so that's what gives it strength. You need to understand how materials bend. You need to understand geometry. And so really as a designer, not only are you dealing with how you design the process, but also understand what are the limits of the material, understanding how does the material sort of behave. And at that point, I was teaching at Harvard, and I began to have more and more an interest in sort of process. But I had this experience, and I went to a party, and at the party, I met a wonderful neuroradiologist, so somebody who's a doctor of radiology, looks at images of your brain and was specialized in stroke. And he said, "Oh, you're a medical designer." He made this incredible leap from the plywood. This was for a wheelchair, because I was involved in somehow making wood components for a wheelchair, that I was suddenly a medical product designer, which I wasn't. But sometimes these misunderstandings can be quite productive. And so he said, you should come look, we have a design problem, a device problem. And the problem is he was involved in stroke care. Stroke is a disruption of blood flow to the brain. And so time is brain is fundamentally the mantra. And sometimes to be treated, you need to be scanned on different imaging devices. And here's one. So you would have an MRI, a CT scanner, sometimes an X-ray. And the problem was that the beds for these devices were non-compatible, and it meant that you would have to physically lift a patient from one bed to another bed to image it. I've been in the operating room and I've seen where, 100-kilo old male who's unconscious on one of these beds is lifted up by 6 nurses, and the IV line gets unplugged because somebody trips on it. It's a very messy, very difficult, time-consuming shift that has to happen, and it adds no value. It actually detracts from value. And so Gil said, why can't you design a compatible bed? And then we looked at the problem and we realized, Gil, we're asking the wrong question here. The problem is not the bed. The problem is business logics. The problem is organizational logics. The problem is hospital design logics. Siemens, who makes one device, it has no incentive to make an interoperable device with GE, for example. And the way that these things get marketed and the way that hospitals and specialties work against the idea of interoperability. And so we realized to solve this product problem, you need to actually look at the bigger problem. And this is what got me into sort of the line of work that I do nowadays, right? And I'll talk about this in just a moment, but I led a 5-year project at Harvard called the Stroke Pathways Project, which was really to rethink healthcare delivery for stroke patients from cradle to grave. if we had all the science and knowledge that we have today, would we design the system that we have today? And a lot of the challenges we're dealing with in government aren't at the level of the bed, they're at the level of the system. And so it begs the question of where is design positioned with relation to the issues that we're dealing with? What are our capacities and experiences to operate at that level? All right, and now I have a practice. I was at the Finnish Innovation Fund for 5 years trying to embed this kind of practice. We built a whole bunch of platforms, including Helsinki Design Lab and initiatives, including Low to No. And now I do that same work through my practice and teach 2 days a week at Aalto University. All right, I want to show you this. If there's one thing you remember, maybe it might be this. I don't know how many people have seen this movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommended it. It's a movie about foxes that have completely human traits. And so let's listen to this, and then I'll say a few words about it.
Yeah, I'm getting no sound, Marco.
Oh, I am terribly sorry. I am terribly sorry. I thought. Hold on. Can we? I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to reshare because there's a little toggle I need to do. So just bear with me for 1 second here. Sorry, guys, because it's more fun than I am. All right, so let's go back in here, and I'm going to toggle. You should be able to hear it in just a second. All right. Give me a thumbs up if you hear it.
I don't want to live in a hole anymore. It makes me feel poor.
We are poor, but we're happy.
Comme ci, comme ça. Anyway, the views are better above ground. Honey, I'm 7 non-fox years old now. My father died at 7.5. I don't want to live in a hole anymore, and I'm going to do something about it. Well, I'm off. Have a good day, my darlings.
So anyhow, it's fantastic. I love that, right? So just when we believe these were human, their true nature, their true impulse of being animals is kind of revealed. And I think this represents in a certain way a kind of cognitive dissonance that I think exists in both us as individuals, meaning that we believe in something, but we behave in a different way. Those things are not aligned. But also as institutions. Institutions are for progress, and yet maybe that's not what they're doing, for example, right? And I think to be caught in cognitive dissonance is very stressful, and it creates certain sort of primordial behaviors that I think we're seeing both at the level of individuals and at society. So if you've seen the movie, one of the good friends is the possum. And every time there's a moment where there's clearly like a conflict, a cognitive dissonance moment, this is what happens. He freezes, right? And the eyes go all googly. I think this is what we're having in terms of government and the kind of dissonance between the efficacy of the system, the history of these systems, the knowledge in these systems, and yet the kind of sheer kind of nature of the issues that we need to grapple, the scale, the speed, and the scope of those things. And it creates a certain kind of paralysis. All right. So cognitive dissonance, which is maybe the thread that I want to try to connect in the things that I want to talk about in the next 20 minutes, is a conflict resulting from simultaneously held incongruous beliefs and attitudes. I also looked at the American Psychological Association. It's a bit more wordy: unpleasant psychological state resulting from inconsistency between 2 or more elements in a cognitive systems. It is presumed to involve a state of heightened arousal, not necessarily in a good way, and to have characteristics similar to psychological drives, hunger, et cetera, et cetera. So stress, the kind of primordial reaction, these kinds of things that aren't part of the rational analytical side of us are the things that then kind of break through very much. And what happens in psychologies is people try to reduce this dissonance because it is stressful. And one way to do that is to ignore the things that are creating that dissonance. Ignore facts, ignore realities, for example. Return to an idea of a simpler time, these kinds of things. And so those are natural reactions. All right, so let's take that as a kind of basic premise, and this is to scale the Finnish government just healthcare spending in 2024 compared to the amount of money that the Finnish government spends on innovating the system. And so you can see the scale here. And if you missed it, the scale is right here. So the red dot compared to the blue dot. And if we want to look at that a little bit more carefully, this is about 50 million euros, trying to change a ship that is the size of 16 plus billion, right? It's a 0.3% R&D budget on the system itself. And then we can ask ourselves, where are those resources being deployed? And on the vertical here, I have, these are fairly random terms, so be generous with me, but I'm trying to represent the idea of scale. We go from small to big. So we could be on the individual scale, at the service scale, organizational, community, subsystem, or system. And for the most part, these grants are given and this money is distributed at the organizational level, meaning that a hospital gets this money, for example. And the range of money is 10 to 100,000 euros. So think about how this tiny amount of money then gets highly fragmented and spread like jam across toast into all of these hospitals. All it can do at its best is suboptimize what's happening in a hospital. And the things that are happening at a systems level aren't really at the systems level. They tend to be more at the subsystem level. For example, most of this money is actually going to computer IT kinds of systems. And actually much of the money that's dubbed innovation is really for upkeep or modernizing equipments or databases, et cetera, et cetera. And some of that money is actually trying to do dual purpose. For example, we have systems, how to manage data in health systems for Finland. And then there's a EU directive that is requiring those interoperability across Europe. So that same money that was earmarked for the Finnish stuff now has to do double duty and start to look at how it connects to over there. So if we're being honest, it's about €0 that's being spent on rethinking the concept of healthcare and its delivery. Right. So, of course, if this is not working well and we're never rethinking, we're driving the same old, coal-powered tricycle that we first made, it's going to be inefficient. It's going to be increasingly inefficient. And I think it's a natural reaction to say, let's doge it, right? Let's go in and just make it more efficient. But when your logic for efficiency is just smaller, then you'll just have a smaller coal-powered tricycle. You don't fundamentally have ideas about what creates value at the system level. And I think the people in Doge don't have a clue about what creates value in a system, right? A lot of funding, a lot of good ideas don't create a coherent system, let alone a more effective sort of system. All right, so what is this concept of efficiency? And I want to work it through an example from practice, right? But before I do that, this curve is, I always show this just to put things in perspective. This is GDP per capita in England. It is adjusted for inflation. So, back one liter of milk back then, 1 liter of milk here. So it's the same sort of pound, let's put it that way. And so this is really, I think, something that you can say is divided into 3 acts. The first act is that straight flat plateau. And actually, you could go back about 6,000 years and it's flat. There's really no improvement. And then Act 2, surprise, surprise, happens around the Industrial Revolution, right? We have a completely new concept of how we're going to deliver a progress. And it creates a lot of value and it creates a lot of purchasing power, and people get are better off. And we're at the tail end of that logic right now. We're seeing it's not delivering their way. And that's the Act 3 that we're sort of caught in right now. I love this quote from Andy Haldane, the former Bank of England chief economist. Since 1750, has taken around 50 years for living standards to double. Before that, 6,000 years. So think of yourself as being a link in a long family chain where there's your parents, your great grandparents, your great grandparents, and go back. And imagine all those generations in your family that sat around for 6,000 years looking out the window and seeing no progress. And here I mean progress in the way that we tend to talk about progress through our sort of government metrics. And then suddenly this new logic of industry, new logic of leadership, of fundamentally of governance too, because we're putting businesses together, et cetera, comes along. And in one generation, basically, people see their living standards double. And then we use those methods to teach people scientific, management, and all of those kinds of ways of thinking about the world. And I think we thought we found the holy grail of progress, right? So when we go and try to change things, we need to realize we're messing with that legacy and a formula that was so pervasive and so successful that we're going deep, deep into not just institutional sense of self, but individual. And it becomes an existential question. But I narrowed it down to say, look, a lot of our ideas about institutions and what good governance is come from the 18th century. We're looking at statistics and operating in a very 20th century way, and yet we're dealing with 21st century problems. And it's the mismatch between these logics, which is, I think, at the core of all the dilemmas that we have. Right? We have hierarchical, fragmented, linear organizations trying to deal with a world that's complex, interconnected, and ambiguous. And I don't care how much you tweak around the margins, if the tool and the problem don't match up, you're never going to get the kinds of efficiencies that we really need to do. So a lot of the work I've been involved in is to try to, this sounds very grandiose, so forgive me, but to design the logic that can deliver a different kind of outcome. So we're getting into questions of organizational design. We're getting into questions of sort of systems and how do you design systems, in addition to all the other traditional things. And actually, you need to think about how you bring all that together, because systems without services means that systems don't exist. And organizations that aren't delivering anything likewise. All right. So let me walk through this, and then I'll probably skip the next one. But so this is this project that got me into this world, and from which I've sort of kept working. As you remember, Gil thought the problem was that designers weren't smart enough to create an interoperable bed, and we realized actually it was a whole host of things, right? It was regulation, business logics, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as I mentioned, this is a scan of a brain, and you can see the blood vessels here. When you get a stroke, you get a disruption of blood flow, and so it affects part of your brain. And you can, it might be a small stroke, and you may not even notice it. A big stroke, you could lose some function, speech, or mobility, or you could die. It's actually the second cause of death in the US, and the third cause of long-term disability. So it's a very significant disease in sort of Western societies. All right, and the logic of the system of stroke care, whether it's the US or the UK or Finland, it's basically the same mental construct, is this study from 1995, which really looked at a broad group of patients, because before then there was no treatment for stroke. So you would just be given a glass of water, and they basically created a drug that you would be given intravenously that would help dissolve a clot. And so if you've ever had a problem in your kitchen plumbing, there's probably some liquid you can pour into it that dissolves the clot. This is the analog for the body, right? And they found that if you pour this liquid down into the body within 3 hours of having a stroke, there are more positive than negative consequences. If you wait too long, then let's say the chemical corrodes the pipes too long, and you can get the possibility of the pipe bursting, so to speak. So you get into hemorrhages and other kinds of things, right? So now we have a drug for the very first time, and a system is built around the logic of the drug, or the interpretation of the data that drove this logic, which is time is brain. We need to get patients into door to needle, is what they talk about. The moment you leave the door to needle, How quick is that? And that needs to be under three hours, right? And so the mantra was time is brain, and that's the 3-hour thing. In fact, if you look in the UK, you would have seen NIH posters saying fast in the US. So if you have these symptoms, get to the hospital as soon as possible. And the prevailing thinking was that the problem now was with us. Meaning that we're not going to the hospital fast enough. And if we could just get the whole population to the hospital fast enough, then stroke done. Let's move on to the next disease. This work was a cradle to grave. It involved colleagues from the business school, the medical school, and industry. And my job was really to sort of bring this sort of large-scale collaboration together. One of the things we found out, which is not all strokes are the same. Think of cuts. If you have a cut could describe a paper cut, or a cut could also describe a severe chest wound. Now, if I'm in the business of making Band-Aids, most cuts are small cuts, and so a Band-Aid is pretty effective, but a Band-Aid is not going to be effective on the categories of cuts that are most driving your outcomes, the ones that are going to potentially lead to deaths or long-term disability. So we found that these are actual patients in a hospital. The blues are people who have minor strokes, meaning that they're small capillaries in their blood vessels. It's the outermost places. They're tiny little streets that are blocked. Not much traffic going on there, not many places to go. It's probably not going to do much damage. And the red are actually large vessel occlusions, meaning that a vessel in your neck, for example, is blocked. Half of your brain is not receiving blood, therefore it can have a big impact. And what we found out is that all the strokes that cause long-term disabilities or death are actually in this other category, which is the minority. It's only 20% of strokes, right? So you can see at the time the reimbursement for stroke was $5,000 because it was calibrated to the average cost of a stroke. And that's not a very wise use of money, because what you want to do is you want to target the stroke patients who are driving your outcomes. And when we talk about long-term disabilities, we know it's not just direct money, it's lost opportunity, all kinds of things, indirect costs of that as well, right? So this is a little bit where the statistics questions comes in, and our understanding actually how do different categories of people or patients behave, and how do they behave differently, and how should we in a way address those issues differently. But there was a very basic fundamental question, is that nobody had really asked a basic question of where do people live? If your assumption is people aren't calling hospitals fast enough, then your assumption must be that everybody is within reach of care, that they're within a catchment area of 3 hours. And it turned out that back in the day when we were doing this work 20 years ago, no one had actually asked that very basic question. So we created the first, in a way, repository, you could call it, of stroke hospitals. We looked at all hospitals that had stroke, and we had a kind of minimum criteria they had to meet, because these things were being tabulated on a state-by-state basis, but not on a national basis. And then we put census data. So the darker parts here are where people are living, and we're seeing whether people are living within 30 minutes of hospitals, right? So how do we do that? Well, this is where I think part of our design skills also come into, is that we can use visual tools to do analysis and help make complex sets of issues very accessible to decision makers. So what you'll see is tiny red dots, which you don't see yet, which will have growing white circles emanate from them. And these are catchment areas. Now we're using the idea of direct distance as a placeholder for travel, right? So imagine you have a stroke and you fly like a bird in a straight line. How far could you fly in 30 minutes if you were flying at the speed of a car? And so I don't have time to explain it, but it's 30 miles, which is 30 minutes of travel that you can, because there are things that need to happen on both ends of transport that take time out of that 3 hours. So let's take a look. It will expand beyond the catchment area of 30 minutes, right? But it'll give you a little bit of sort of sense here. So these are all stroke hospitals, and boom, and then it'll come back down. All right. So just trust me, because we don't have time. The country is, from a landmass perspective, about 50% covered. The population is about 50% covered, sorry. The landmass much less, right? Now, 50% is your glass ceiling. This would suggest that if everybody in the US calls a hospital, this is the maximum amount of people you can come in. Now, we already know that's problematic because we don't fly like birds. There's traffic in the roads. So Massachusetts understood this and realized the way to solve this is to have more hospitals, right? And so they made all of their 79 hospital stroke centers at a huge political and financial cost. And when you look at the outcomes of this, you realize that within about 10 miles, you have about 90% of your population. So it looks like policy works on paper. Most people are within reasonable treatment window to care. Now, what they hadn't really understood is that census data is great until you leave your home, because census data counts where you live, right? And so here are two areas you can see, Cape Cod and the Berkshires. These are very popular summer travel destinations. And so what's the effect of movement within populations across territory? How much of the population is going to travel outside of care, unwittingly outside of care, because they're going to the Cape for the summer, for example? And how high risk is that in terms of the overall population? We found out, and I don't have time to get into this, that there is a yearly cycle to stroke, meaning you and I are most likely to have a stroke in the summer, right? And this is where we could say coincides kind of nicely with summer vacations. So you have a high propensity of people to travel to places. They're either going to national parks, like in this case, where there is no care, or they might going to Paris, where they're unfamiliar with the care system and hence are potentially more delayed in getting. So what is the effect of that? And the purpose of design is not to give absolute questions, is to raise new questions and ask whether the issues we're trying to deal with, we understand the magnitude of scale of these things. All right, so let me try to wrap this one up right here and suggest a couple things. So we took this Euclidean way of thinking about time and said, look, people don't fly, people need to drive. So we worked with the Department of Transportation and got actual traffic data. And so this circle is going to shrink twice. Once for how far can you drive to stroke centers. And it turns out this is Boston. All the stroke centers are right here. They're across the street from each other. So from a policy perspective, not the smartest thing to do. So how far out could you be to be able to get to this hospital within 30 minutes? That's doing normal driving. And then we'll do it again. The second time it shrinks is doing peak traffic. And why is peak traffic important? Because apparently there is a yearly cycle for stroke where most people are going to get a stroke in the summer. And there's a daily cycle, which happens to coincide with morning traffic, rush hour. The reason for that is that when I'm sleeping at night and then I suddenly get up in the morning, two things happen. One is my posture changes, and then my blood pressure rises because I'm getting stressed that I need to talk to a bunch of colleagues in the UK, right? So the combination of those two things make it such that the conditions are optimal for a bit of plaque that's somewhere in your body to shoot up into your brain and block it, right? And so you have most of the population getting strokes in the morning. Let's take a look at this. So this is normal driving. This is your catchment area. And then this is for when most people are going to get a stroke. So it turns out that only about 10% of your population in those circles I showed you early on are effectively within reach. And so our 50% has now become 5% nationally. On a drug, when you look at it, is only 10%, actually 12% effective, meaning that out of 100 patients that get it, 12 or better. So your glass ceiling is 0.6% of your population will get better with the system. By the way, that is a bit like a Band-Aid. It's most effective for the small strokes. TPA, this drug, is not very effective on big strokes, right? So we see policymakers take science, build a system around it based on assumptions, and we don't realize actually how off target we are on these things. And part of that work is not just using design to do the anthropology kind of work. We found out that a lot of elderly people who have had a stroke, and if you think of the care cycle, need then rehabilitation as an important aspect of reintegrating them into a normal life. and making them independent. And the independence is better quality of life and less public financing to support them, right? So there's many positive aspects into that. And a lot of them actually don't get rehab because in the winters they're afraid to drive to the hospital because it's slippery and the only person that lives with them is their elderly spouse. So there are social conditions and other things that we need to understand and understand how much do they impact the overall solution. So we do the anthropology side of this, we do the system side of this, we understand how science of clinical science, the ability to question it, to do the integrative teamwork, to do the visualization, et cetera, to begin to create a strategic picture on healthcare to help policymakers understand and politicians understand how to bring greater efficiency into this. And it's really by rethinking the underlying principles that govern better outcomes in this case. All right, so I'm going to do one thing here. And so we developed in a way a portfolio way of working about things, right? So this helped us build a methodology, like how do you do this kind of systems work? It helped us generate political influence. If I actually go back, I just want to show very much here a little bit. The design of the governance model was to say that I'm leading a team that is a multidisciplinary team. It's not a building, so I don't have a structural engineer, I don't have an electrical engineer, et cetera, et cetera. It's a medical problem, so I have a medical expert, I have a business expert, and so on. And then we have an advisory group that is kind of the Noah's Ark of the stakeholders around the problem. We had the CEO of GE because they do imaging, former CEO of Glaxo because that's the company that does the drug, TPA. We had people like Donna Shalala, former health minister in the US, David Cutler, economics advisor to Obama. Daryl Ray comes from the product and business world, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, we're trying to learn from them, but we're also trying to influence them and how they think about how decisions need to be made and what is the value of design. So if I go back here, it's about creating political influence to understand problems in a different way, but it's also to try to begin to build a bit of a seat for design at the table. And in doing so, we came up with provisional patents for a new medical device, a new way of classifying strokes and triaging them, a new reimbursement model. We worked regional hospital networks to pilot and implement some of this stuff. And we created some new research that was peer reviewed. In fact, one of the things I'm most proud of is that I've been published in one peer-reviewed article in my life, and it's for the American Association of Neuroradiology, something I'd never thought of as an architect to publish in. Right. So if I looked at this and mapped this on a government, these would be different ministries that aren't built to talk to each other. The kind of creative work that needs to happen here is very different from the collaborative nature of work that we do right now in government, et cetera, et cetera. I see we have only 9 minutes. There were a couple topics I wanted to get into, but I much rather hear maybe some questions, thoughts, and maybe we could spend that time answering people's curiosities or reflections. Over to you, Tessa.
Thanks so much, Marco, for that presentation. That was really interesting, and have a couple of reflections and people popping up in the chat. I think that we've got a question from Molly on how to move from cognitive dissonance to holding multiple truths. If you want to come off, I'll come on camera and ask your question, Molly.
It's a bit earlier in the morning for me right now, so I'm not going to come off camera, but I will say hello and hi, Marco. Hi, Andy. And yeah, I love the way you're framing the cognitive dissonance as something to kind of support our government partners or our other partners that we work through complexity with. And so I was thinking when you were saying that, how do we move into the mode of holding multiple truths and kind of moving from like the dissonance part into the generative part of seeing the multiplicity in a situation. It doesn't totally apply to the project you shared, but maybe you have some insights about that, Marco. It's something we definitely deal with in our work with government partners here in Atlantic, Canada. So
yeah, no, thanks. And yeah, something that I've sort of thought about a lot. I think part of the cognitive dissonance, and again, I want to underscore, this applies as much to us as individuals as to the institutions that we operate in. And the nature of the behavior of institutions is not just a simple sum of the behavior of individuals. So I think we need to keep those two things sort of separate. So if I were to look at this issue from a kind of, let's say, government institution perspective, I think the map of Finland that I showed you is that there's an incredible dissonance between, in our funding logics, for example, between, let's say, the rhetoric of innovating and being in the 21st century and transforming our healthcare systems and the reality of how resources are allocated and to what and in what manner. Right? It's just like we're on two different sort of planets. So I think part of it is we first need to have an honest accounting of what is the reality of that dissonance? Where is that coming from? And I think only once we acknowledge that, then we can kind of begin to figure out how do we work within it. I will throw a kind of random sort of reflection onto that just because this probably would require more time. I've been increasingly frustrated by the kind of request I've gotten over the years from colleagues, non-design colleagues in government, which is they want the toolkit. I'm frustrated by a couple reasons. One is I've never heard somebody going to the doctor and just asking for the toolkit, right? I'd much rather the doctor do the surgery than get the toolkit. So I'm not trying to trivialize that question because I think there's some truths in there. I think everybody can benefit from a kind of design approach, which is a kind of holistic, integrative approach to things. But sometimes you need the surgeon in the room to have that high professional skills to be able to perform something. So I'm not sure we're going to solve the institutional challenges that we have by just sprinkling more tools into it. And I forget, oh, actually I have the book in front of me, so it turns out just randomly. So I'm going to turn this off because I can't say his name, not because it's a bad name, but if you see his name, his last name's kind of complicated. Anyhow, you may be familiar with this author and professor from the University of Chicago, psychologist. He wrote the book Flow. And I think if we go back to this question of psychology, because I think it's both individual and institutional psychology, when we're under a lot of stress, we're in a fight or flight mode. And what that means, it's a survival mode, and it means that your vision, you get tunnel vision. And so your individual instinct is going to be very anti-design by just nature. You don't want to see more, you want to see less. You want to know known, you want safe solutions, et cetera, et cetera. So as institutions are in panicking, which they are, in crisis and in stress, we're trying to do more with less resources and so on. There is this unfortunate tendency to do this. So sprinkling more tools in there, I think is just going to add more stress. Like the job wasn't hard enough, and now you're telling me I need to learn all these new things. So he has a really beautiful statement, which I for me captures very much how I have thought about a lot of these issues in the past. And let me just I want to find it because I'm going to sort of butcher it. Here it is. He says, "It is easier to enhance creativity by changing conditions in the environment than by trying to make people think more creatively," right? So this goes to questions of psychological safety, but what I like, it's a deeper dive into that world, is if we think that design is creative by nature, we need to first ask ourselves, what is that creative dynamic? And for me, it's a kind of combinatory capacity, the capacity to make new connections between things, right? And there's Donald McKinnon in 1958 did the very first study on creativity. It's really worthwhile seeing, right? So if we say that institutions and individuals, we need them to be most creative at this time, and actually we need to do organizational design and resources in a way to augment creativity, then we need to think about actually changing the environment and believing that people have an innate ability to be creative if the environment is in a high stress, fight or flight mode kind of environment. So the focus on tools is actually, I think, a distraction around, I think, the mechanisms that are going to actually work. And so design, I think, is going to have to operate on making a better interface for people, citizens, to experience things, a better service to better deliver better quality for frontline workers, a better system to create better value, better outcomes at sort of low cost, but also the design of organizations themselves so that our institutions can start behaving differently. Sorry for a long-winded answer, but I think these are some of the elements that we need to really think about. And if I go back to where resources are being put, it's very much at the interface or single service level at very small increments. And a lot of design, I would say, in good and bad, is sort of focused there. And so I think we need to both figure out how we get design into the framing of issues as well as the solving of the technical issues that stem from that. Maybe one more question. I know we're up for time, or we can also close it. I know people have busy lives.
I think maybe we've got time for one more. I think Leonie was first. She wants to ask your question.
Sorry, Leonie went quiet there while she was just fiddling with the controls. Yeah, I'm very familiar with research techniques and quite familiar with systems thinking, and I follow Andrew Knight's work trying to kind of join up policy with user-centered techniques in government. I'm interested to know what you had to do with the data to allow to get to see the correlation between incidence of stroke with time of year, with the traffic patterns, with the other factors that allowed you to build this picture of where, for example, putting stroke centres might be most effective, or as a basis for creating policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very
thanks.
dry area, I appreciate, but I value your insight.
Thanks, Lonnie. I think one thing to keep in mind that's important, the kind of the idea of how do you, in a way, address the challenge? How do you create, better outcomes? Goes back to the idea of a portfolio. You're not going to deal with a single policy issue, not on a single, ministry or department or topic. It's a series of different things that you need to do. And so you kind of alluded already there that we needed a triage systems. We need to do a variety of kind of things. And it's understanding that mix. It's very much like cooking. We need to get, you can make a horrible cake or a great cake. And it depends a little bit about how you mix the ingredients, the proportions, but also the sequence. And I think for politicians, this is very difficult because usually when I present this kind of approach, the question is, that's great. If I could do only one thing, what would that be? And it sort of defies this logic. The way we found onto that is, I think, first of all, you need to have a kind of like investigative mindset. There's a crime that's happened. Who done it? And so we're going to go out and look for leads. And we really, I didn't show, but we took this idea of of 3 dimensions that we need to operate along. We need to make sure we don't have strategic blind spots in looking for evidence. So on any issue that we think might be relevant, are we looking at it at different scales, in different contexts, from different perspectives? So for example, are we looking at it as something within a small hospital, a medium hospital, and a large hospital, in a rural, in a suburban, and an urban, and from the perspective of a nurse, a head of radiology, and a CEO, right? And when you begin to triangulate along those things, it helps you ask new questions. And so the role of design may be different from the hard sciences, is not to come to a definite answer. It's not to get more resolution on a problem. It's to begin to create a foundation, a fact-based foundation for asking whether we have the right brief for the challenge, whether we're asking the right questions, whether the magnitude of order. All we needed to do was to show that even if our modeling was wrong on the catchment area, the magnitude, we're so off the magnitude order that this kind of policy trajectory we're on is just not effective. It's never going to create greater until we figure out all these other. And then there's tons of repercussions on the technical issues, right? Sorry, we're going a little over, but I want to just dwell on this a little bit. we found out that time does not matter as much as we thought. And if you thought of the vessels in the brain as kind of like a map of a city with roads, and the question is, a road or an artery is blocked, will people be delayed to getting to work? The basic question in a city is, well, it depends if there are alternative routes for me to get to work. And if you have a good route network, you might have a big traffic jam on a bit highway, but people are still getting to work on time. And the same is with the brain. Each brain is wired differently. And so it turns out that maybe you have 5 minutes, you're unlucky, and there are no alternative routes for blood to flow to that part of the brain, and that part of the brain dies very quickly. Or you have great, what is called sort of secondary circulation patterns, and you have 24 hours. Now, the average is 3, and the policy is trying to focus on a patient that doesn't exist. Because for the imaging reasons back in 1995, we couldn't discern things in the brain, and therefore we came with statistical averages, which aren't very good. So you need to go deep into the weeds and ask questions across a whole range of issues to begin to see if you see micro and macro patterns emerging, and whether there are new questions that are emerging. And almost like in detective stories, you need to have that giant board where you're putting all the clues up and with wire trying to figure out whether there's a pattern emerging of who did it and what's the logic of it. So as you can tell from my very clumsy description, it involves a different way of working in a team. It actually requires almost like physical things. You need to sit in the same room. You can't do the detective work on TV as it's shown if people are sitting in different buildings, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of repercussions on organizational design, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, sorry for fumbling that, but hopefully you captured something.
That's the best description of what researchers do in government I think I've heard yet. So thank you for that.
Okay.
My question was about the much more mundane. What format was the data in, and what did you have to do
what
with
the
it?
format was the
Maybe
data
we
in,
can pick that up offline.
Yeah. I will just say one curiosity about the data, because in most countries there is the Freedom of Information Act in one form or another. So we went to the Department of Health in Massachusetts and said, give us all the stroke data. And they put it on a CD-ROM, and then we tried to open it. And it was the longest string of numbers and letters. And so we came back and asked them, how do we open this? And no one actually knew how this data could be used. They had a mandate to collect data, but they don't have enough money to sort of manage those systems. So it's sort of like saying, collect all the letters in all the books, and there's a big pile of letters, and then no one really knows, because it hasn't been really curated, what letter goes sort of where. So that's a separate problem. But yeah, sorry.
All right, thanks very much, Marco, for sharing your work, and for everyone engaging and asking questions. Andrew has pasted a link in the chat with more info on joining the community. So if you'd like to join the upcoming events, you can find information there. And yeah, thanks again for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Hi.